was going to say rotary telephones. I was around for those, and they had charm. You could really express yourself by the way you dialed a number on a rotary telephone. There was a music to it that I
Was that the one that goes like this?
Yeah.
I remember those.
You were around for those? Yeah, see, they were great. They should bring them back. I'd like one on my mobile phone.
When I say I remember those, I remember going into an antique store and seeing one of those.
Well, that burns. Well, that burns. All right, then. So what are we doing today? We're doing something a little different. We both went away. We're going to see how this works out as maybe an ongoing thing. We went away and found some things about books, reading and writing, etc., that we found interesting. We're going to talk about those one after the other. So I was thinking, we could call this Bookends and Odds, or Bookends and Oddities. What about that?
Yeah, I do like that.
Bookends and Oddities. See, that's a little bit of brainstorming live on tape.
Where should we begin? I think I came to the table with an article that popped up on my phone from The Economist, and it was titled "The Business of Mining Literary Estates is Booming." And I scrolled a bit through that, and it was very interesting. And did you get a chance to read that article, Gareth?
I did. I am prepared. Tell me about it, though. Imagine I hadn't read it. What would you say about it?
I'll read the first paragraph because I found it very humorous. Quote, Lord Byron intended to publish his memoir, but his literary executor burned it instead. T.S. Eliot is thought never to have wanted songs made about his cats. Terry Pratchett, a British fantasy writer, had imagination. His former assistant honoured Pratchett's wish to have a steamroller crush a hard drive containing the author's unfinished stories. Roald Dahl, author of dark, delightful children's tales, might have done something equally drastic had he known scriptwriters would conjure up a teenaged Willy Wonka. Dahl, who died in 1990, detested the first film made of his Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It is hard to imagine him cheering its prequel, Wonka, which will be released in December. And I suppose that gives a good cover of what this article goes on to discuss, and it talks about how there's such a hunger in these online streaming services to get their hand on content and keep producing content to the point that there seems to be no new material for them to get their fingers on or into, and so they're now mining all these old literary estates, as we've seen with Roald Dahl. I think that sold for $700 million to Netflix giant.
Yeah, look, I'm going to give Netflix props, though. The first few short films they've done of his work have been really excellent. I would recommend them. They're done by, what's his name? They were done by Wes Anderson, and they were done in Anderson's signature style, which is very staged, very sort of flat, and they feel very readerly, I suppose. And yeah, I watched the whole lot. I was going to just watch one to fill in some time, because I had to spare 15 minutes, and the first one I found was 17 minutes. I thought I could go over by 2. And then I just ended up spending quite a long time watching the whole lot. They're really, really good. So, I mean, that's a good outcome. I'm less convinced. I noticed in this article we have, I'll quote, "Consider Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey," a film released this year in which Pooh and Piglet, A.A. Milne's lovable, nearly 100-year-old characters, become bloodthirsty killers. So yeah, that's a strange thing, isn't it? Are you familiar with Pooh? Are you a Pooh person?
I think we're all familiar with Pooh on a daily basis, hopefully. But have not read. I remember watching the film Winnie the Pooh, and I found it interesting that apparently there's a scene where Christopher is jumping off a log, and Disney used that same drawing or imagery for Jungle Book. So there's a lot of reused images.
Okay.
Yeah, when Mowgli is jumping down, but that's neither here nor there. And I was watching a movie last night with Luke and Patrick, and on Netflix there was something called The Cocaine Bear, which is meant to be a horror of a bear who gets into a sack of cocaine and starts rampaging, killing people. Maybe it's a good idea that we're trying to mine literary estates because no one seems to be coming up with great horror ideas except for a cocaine guzzling bear.
Yeah, that's probably not one of the better ones. Actually, I'll give a shout out to Ty West. I think he is coming up with great horror ideas. He's done a bunch of good films. His latest two are X and the prequel to that, Pearl, which I think he wrote with its star Mia Goth. Very good. Very good. So get into those folks after you listen to this podcast. But yeah, I don't know about Pooh. I mean, I love Pooh. I hope this doesn't get sampled. I do love Pooh and Piglet. And yeah, there's something unsettling about the idea of their. I mean, clearly it's there's an intention, to mine some comedy with them being completely opposite to the way they are. But I don't know. It's fine as a sort of think. Oh yeah, that's pretty funny. But can you make a film out of it? Is it that funny? Is it sustainably funny? Pooh drenched in blood. This all just sounds wrong. Piglet with a hatchet. I don't know. I'm not sure you'll get 90 minutes of joy out of that. But what are you going to do? I mean, a lot of this has to do with copyright and estates, running to the end of their copyright. We talked about that in our censorship episode.
Yeah, we did. We've talked about Dahl extensively, so definitely go check out those podcasts. Actually, I want to keep reading some sections from this article. Mm-hmm. Quote, yet Dahl's legacy represents a new twist in the tale. Huge sums paid in 2021 for his estate by Netflix, a streaming service, have helped spur a gold rush to mine dead authors' estates. Once it was intrusion by Snoopy biographers that worried writers most. Today, it is the temptation among heirs to monetize every shred of creative output. Authors have long tried to control what happens to their works after they die, and mostly failed.
Yeah, well, they give it their best, don't they? I mean, I suppose the ethics of all this is interesting for sure, but there are there are traditions within literature that this is not threatening at all. I noticed there's right near the end of the article. I hope I'm not doing a spoiler here. Trickiest of all are so-called continuation novels, such as Julia, a brilliant recent retelling of George Orwell's 1984 from a feminist perspective. Traditionalists who might accept a new treatment of a classic in another medium often bridle at books that appear to change the intellectual legacy of a great author. Now, I don't see how Julia does change the intellectual legacy of Orwell's work. I mean, obviously it's a response to it. But, in literature, Harold Bloom would say in literature, there are strong readings, and those readings are new books, and sometimes those books overwhelm their precursors. And he always cites the great example of how critics today read Chaucer in relation to Shakespeare, even though Shakespeare came much, much later. So I don't know, is Julia a threat to 1984? What do you think?
It's a good question. And to me, the purpose of 1984 is creating that atmosphere of we're not in control of, or there's a greater power in control, so them versus us, and then the erasure of the past. So in a sense, creating Julia, if it is acting as an erasure of 1984, I would have an issue with the whole purpose of the book. But if it's just 1984 rewritten from a feminine perspective with a female character, I don't see that being controversial to his intent for that novel.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think it threatens it at all. 1984 was Orwell's response to We. And I love We as well. I love Pooh and I love We. We by Yevgeny Zamyan, the Russian novelist. Orwell read We and was so taken by it, he wanted to write a variation of it, and that became 1984. Now, it's true that a lot of people who like 1984 are not aware of We, but I think that isn't so much because Orwell wrote 1984. I think it's because Russian sci-fi is often overlooked. But again, you've got this genealogy of We 1984 Julia. And who knows how the three books impact each other and what reflections they have between each other in the sort of house of mirrors that they make up. But I actually think it's a really healthy thing. And ultimately, because we believe that creativity is sparked by a sort of almost genetic genius that, or God whispering in our ear or whatever it is. The idea that books are, always reactions to other books isn't a popular idea, but I think that's exactly the truth of it. Or certainly texts are always responses to other texts. So I don't think, just in the case of Julia, I don't see a problem with Julia. I think Julia is a good thing.
Yeah, I think there must be distinction because I remember feeling very up in arms about Penguin Random House making edits to Roald Dahl's work and then republishing his stories. But then I suppose I don't have so much of an issue with Wonka being introduced following the story of the young Willy Wonka taking on the chocolate cartel. I think that's the premise of that film. So there must be, I think, you're talking about the continuation piece there.
Yeah, I agree. Wonka's not a problem.
New stories from old stories.
Yeah, if you're creating new stories from old stories, there is no danger to the old stories. If anything, it will make people aware of those older stories, and it sort of houses them within a tradition. And that's, I don't see any of that as a problem. I agree. Editing text, as we talked about in our two censorship podcasts, the editing of these texts seems to be a very obvious cultural mistake. And I think it's important for people to have a sense of history. And really, I think if you want to have an introduction to a book that deals with cultural sensitivities, I think that seems like a perfectly fine thing to do. But yeah, and once you start doing these edits, it just snowballs, and they found that with the James Bond novels. So they Live and Let Die, they dealt with a lot of the racism towards black people, but left in all the racism towards Korean people. So, by the time you take it all out and make sure, everything is just so and inoffensive, what do you have left?
Yeah. And then it seems like we agree that the continuation of creating more material or content from past work is okay. What happens if AI does it?
Well, I guess, if there are AI creations in the world for people to consume, that seems to be neither here nor there. I think the ethics around it are to do with different things. I just want to say one more thing about the edits, though. Consider the following, listeners. Mein Kampf, Hitler's nasty little book. Well, it's not little, actually. It's a bloody brick.
I wouldn't call it little.
Yeah, his nasty large lump of brick, in which he outlines his views on things. Should that be edited to make it, more acceptable? I would assume that would not be considered a good thing, and the argument would be, well, no, if everyone finds it deeply offensive, maybe they'll stop reading it and it'll disappear, and that would be perfectly fine. If that's true, and these other books are so offensive that they're unreadable in their intended form, perhaps they should disappear from history. It's kind of a creative natural selection. I'm very comfortable, reading quote unquote offensive material, and understanding its historical context and the fact that writers are flawed and that we do tend to whitewash history anyway. But really, if it is that much of a problem, then these books will just sink, right? And that's what will happen. And inevitably, most things do. It'll be interesting to see what, the canon of literature looks like in 500 years, and how many books we're aware of are still considered to be canonical.
I'm just enamored with this idea of Mein Kampf being edited to make it more agreeable to a general audience. I don't know how you would even do that.
Or 120 Days of Sodom by Marquis de Sade. I mean, what are you going to do? There'd be nothing left. It'd just be like a sentence, I wrote this at some point. Can't be done.
I was here in 1800s.
Yeah, because, ultimately readers do dictate what rises and falls in literature. And obviously these edits are meant to, in some way, avoid that happening, avoid that kind of natural selection. But I suspect they won't, because, even in edited form, if the author's views, and particularly, in this era now where identity politics is so pronounced, you can see a lovely version of James Bond in which, Bond is a feminist and not at all a racist and, maybe not even a killer. But that Fleming intended him to be that. And will that become a problem? Where you think, wow, this book's fine now, but I know that author's a bit rubbish, isn't he? So I'm not going to read it anyway. I think there's what is being hoped for is that people will forget the past. And that's such a dangerous thing.
Definitely. And again, I'm captured with this image of James Bond being a gardener trying to exterminate aphids from his garden, and that's the extent to which he kills something.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, when we talked about this a few weeks back or a few months back, I don't know when it was. The point was that Fleming didn't make Bond to be a good guy. Fleming was not homophobic at all, but Bond was. So, and so you do run into this problem, and I think it is mired in identity politics that authors are their creations and they're not. So I think that's another issue, and that actually does. I know you segued into AI before, very neatly, it must be said. But then I wrecked it. But fortunately, I have a segue into AI that I think is really interesting. So back in 2016, Google grabbed together a huge number of works. I can't remember how many it was.
183,000 books, if you're referring to the same article.
I'm referring to a different article, but I think it's the same experiment. They took an enormous number of authors. Let's see if I can actually find it. The one thing they don't seem to be saying is how many texts, but I think it was 11,000. Is that correct?
I don't know the article that you're referring to, but I picked up one in the Atlantic where Meta and Bloomberg paid people to take the data of 191,000 books and put them into a trained generative AI system. And it's called Books 3.
Books 3. Yeah. Okay, well, this was an earlier thing. But what was interesting was, so they got these samples, and what they were hoping to do was to take dead authors and see if they could predict what the next line of their texts might be, unfinished texts. But it was all built around the idea that authors have distinct personalities and that those personalities are always clearly represented in their work and consistently represented in their work. And, you know, they didn't end up with much, in my opinion.
Do you mean by distinct personalities, distinct styles of writing? Not
well,
the
they were
personality
seeing them
of the
as
author?
Personalities. Like, you know, if you could get Mark Twain, sit him down in front of you and go, okay, what was the next line of this story? Mark Twain, as an AI persona, would tell you in his distinctive voice. But, you know, that's not the way people write. They don't write the way they talk. And what they were thinking they could use this for was having kind of avatars, I think, where you could type stuff in and it would be translated into how Shakespeare would say it. And that's probably a more likely outcome. But that was a very early thing. That was back in February 2016. And then there's a great article I found in the Boston Globe from the 21st of May this year. And it's entitled, Will GPT Pseudo-Write or Anthropic Complete Great Authors' Unfinished Works? It's a fascinating article. I recommend people read it. But it basically, you know, considers this question for authors that have left unfinished works. Could AI, you know, take these works, analyze them, and somehow complete them? So I guess the question is, do you think it's possible? And then the second question is, do you think it should happen?
Do you think it's possible? Because I know you've done a lot of work and you, in fact, reproduced someone else's work for your thesis using SZ, Roland Barthes, and was it Palm Springs?
Poodle Springs, yeah, but that was...
would it not?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is something I did as a research project many, many years ago. I took Poodle Springs, which... was Raymond Chandler's take on Palm Springs. And he'd written 4 chapters of that novel. It would have been, I think, the 8th Philip Marlowe novel. And he got 4 chapters in and then he passed away. And many years later, on the 100th anniversary of his birth, Robert B. Parker completed the novel. With what I think it would be fair to say were mixed results. So I was very energized by this question. Like, you know, could it have been done better, like objectively? And at the time, I wasn't particularly looking at Poodle Springs. I was looking at all kinds of other books like The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens and so forth. But what grabbed me about Poodle Springs is it had been completed and in a relatively celebrated way. Many critics thought it was brilliant, whereas others thought it was really terrible. And so that one just seemed like a good one to work with because I could compare what I came up with against Robert B. Parker's efforts. And so to to do that, I didn't look at Raymond Chandler's personality, because that would be, I'm sorry, Google, but that would be stupid. What I did do is use Bart's reading analysis, which he devised in SZ, which attempts an incredibly close reading, like really close. Bart, on this first attempt, came up with 5 codes. A code of actions, a code of questions and answers, a code of references, a code of semantic or connoted meanings, and a code of symbolism. And basically, his reading, he does a reading of a short novel called Sarrasine by Honoré de Balzac, and he produces so many annotations across these 5 codes. It's much, much, much larger than the original work. A little bit like it might remind you of House of Leaves. It's all annotations with a little text in the center. But it's extraordinary what he pulled out. But what Bart said, and what I think is absolutely true, is that what he pulls out is his reading, not the book. Because we all have different readings, we all have different degrees of cultural knowledge. As time goes by, connoted meaning shifts because of cultural contexts and also sexual identity and age and all those things. The close reading you might do of Sarrasine at the age of 30 is likely to be somewhat different to the one you do at the age of 60. Nevertheless, what you get from doing all this is this kind of map, and it's a mapping context. So you start to see how, for example, Chandler does use a lot of references to courtly love. And I would have said from reading the first 4 chapters of Poodle Springs that he didn't have any in there. But when you read it really slowly, you break it down into what Barthes calls lexias, which are just sort of little fragments of sentences. I actually found quite a few, and the way they related to various other sort of cultural references, there were shapes to it, which was very interesting. The questions and answers that put all through the text. Questions are raised without there being a question mark. These led to a certain kind of, I'm going to be tricky. Barthes would call this a hermeneutic shape. And essentially what I found was I did see that there was a shape to the story, even though it was a very small fragment. I could see a little bit beyond it as to where it was likely to go based on my reading. So, in other words, the shape of my reading is incomplete reading. I could project the rest of the shape. And so when I started trying to write like Chandler, what I discovered, much to my shock actually, is that I could write like him effortlessly. I hadn't expected that. I thought it would be a much more laborious process. But, because very well, Shannon, I'm a slow writer. It's like squeezing blood out of a stone with me. But when I wrote as Chandler, I was doing a chapter a day. And these were what I submitted for my thesis. I didn't edit them at all. And over the years, when I've been teaching writing classes, I'll talk about this in passing, and I'll give people examples of Chandler's work, Parker's work, and my work, and it's all sort of anonymized. And it's interesting how people will swear up and down that the stuff I wrote is definitely Chandler. Sometimes Chandler's own work, they go, "No, that's not Chandler," which is interesting. And certainly Poodle Springs was a first draft, and a first draft of a man who was ill. And it's not his best work, and there are inconsistencies in it. But nobody whatsoever ever seems to think that what Parker wrote is anything like what Chandler wrote. And I would agree on a naive level, looking at it, think, no, this is not the same at all. But it's interesting to understand why. So yes, I think you can break a text down and establish a sort of a stylistic pattern, a pattern of questions and answers that when you add them all up, often lead to one big question that has a sort of an inevitable answer because of the way the others have been answered. And so I think you could predict something that would be very like what the author intended, but it wouldn't be what they would have done because there's too much. There's just too much nuance in the moment to moment of writing. But yeah, I think AI would be capable of that if the people programming it had a more sophisticated approach than the one they seem to have now. What they seem to be doing now by just feeding in books, that isn't going to work. I'm very confident of that. So my first answer is no, they're not going to be able to complete any unfinished masterpieces the way they're going. But they could, I think.
Yeah, I'm just thinking maybe the missing piece is, because I'm assuming it's these tech guys who are feeding it, but unless you have read a significant amount of books and understand literary techniques and styles, how would you teach AI how to appreciate those little things to come up with something, to come up with that next sentence, or to come up with a continuation novel of, let's say, a James Bond? Maybe that's what's missing.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you, presumably, if you explained how Bart's 5 codes worked and gave AI examples of how they're applied, it could attempt something like that. I do wonder, though, whether it would have the same results because you're feeding in so much information into these AI machines, and certainly one of the criticisms of AI is that it becomes an echo chamber of misinformation as well, and there isn't a great deal of oversight. So a bit like feeding in all of literature into an artificial intelligence, I actually don't think that will make it smarter in terms of being able to comprehend an individual incomplete text. Yeah, too much white noise, I think is what I'm saying.
So I suppose we can assuage people's fear about writing novels getting taken over by AI.
Well, no, I mean, not really. There's, The Death of an Author, which was the novel written by 3 chatbots, and the fella, can't remember his name, but, who cares? He sort of pieced them together. And that was the first published AI novel last year, I think, or maybe it was earlier this year. Apparently it's really bad. I think it was described as a poor man's Dan Brown. Good God. What does that mean?
Well, Dan Brown has sold millions of copies.
He has. I've just been a snob. I think we're way off AI writing work of genuine literary merit, if indeed that is really possible. But I guess, even if it happens, obviously there will be some pressure. If you can produce lots and lots of entertaining, insightful books without having to pay authors, I could see publishers liking that. But I think a lot of publishers wouldn't like it as well because there is, this idea that that books are responses to other books and that we are, through the literary canon and the things that should be in the canon, we are sort of mapping the development of the human race and the human consciousness and our sensibilities. And yeah, I think a lot of publishers would balk at abandoning that project, which, I think is the underlying project of publishing. But also, if you want to write a book, AI can't stop you. So indeed, there may be more competition, but there's already so much competition now that, I don't think it'll make that big a difference. And yeah, if you're a writer, don't feel threatened by AI because you can write. And the AI can't stop you. Wow, wouldn't it be scary if it could? Yeah, but that's not going to happen.
Start reading Julia in 1984.
Well, 1984 is a good one for that sort of thing, yeah. I haven't read Julia, I must admit. Although I'm now
Neither have I.
I
actually hadn't heard of it until today. It'd be interesting. I really enjoyed We.
Yeah, We's good, isn't it? It deals with a whole
AI
different aspect of what is now the present, but what was the future. People in glass houses with no privacy, no sort of sense of individualism.
And the ticketing sexual partner system, I found that very interesting. And I think the whole premise is that they want to get beyond the wall and outside, and that kind of, sorry, spoilers, that's how it happened. But I can't recall that happening in 1984. It was a turnaround, sadder ending.
Yeah, it's a very different book, isn't it? And one would hope
very different.
that Julia is a very different book. If it's a sort of a pretty faithful revision with a different slant, that seems quite a dull project. But I'm assuming no one would spend that much time on something like that, except maybe AI. But yeah, one hopes that Julia would be something quite different.
Mm. And talking about continuing works, because we've talked about AI being able to finish this next sentence of a lot of these famous authors. You mentioned Mark Twain. Have you heard of Robert Jordan before and the Wheel of Time series?
Yeah, I've heard of him, but I haven't read it.
So what I found interesting, because when we were talking about this topic and I mentioned how Brandon Sanderson was requested by Robert Jordan's wife to finish the Wheel of Time series. I started this series when I think he published the first one in 1990. So I've read this throughout my whole childhood. I think there's about 14 plus books in this series, and they are thick. They're about 1,000, like a Lord of the Rings novel style length novel in each single one. So imagine that across 14 books. And Brandon Sanderson was not friends with Robert Jordan. He'd only heard of him or seen him at a convention once, and he got approached by his wife to finish it. And he was able to piece it together after giving all his notes. It took him 5 months to construct it. And the point that I find interesting is that Brandon Sanderson said that he taught himself how to write fantasy by reading Robert Jordan. And then throughout that, he's now finished his series, which is a pretty epic story in itself. So what do you think about people finishing other people's work as a last request? Very different to getting your hard drive rolled over by a steam train, as in Terry Pratchett's example.
Yeah, look, I think it's fine. It's an interpretation, and God knows, 14 books in, there should be enough clues across those 14 books to be able to arrive at some sort of plausible 15th. I would imagine even without notes, that would be doable. It's interesting. I mean, the two things I find really interesting is that Jordan's wife wanted Sanderson, and I wonder why, specifically him, particularly if he wasn't a fantasy writer, and if the Jordan
I can read
project.
A quote from the interview.
Yeah, please.
So this interview was written by Dave Goldar, So it's Brandon Sanderson talking. Quote, I saw him once at a convention, but I didn't know him. I saw him as a fan and he wouldn't have known me from Adam. He asked his wife, Harriet McDougall, to find someone to finish the series, and after he passed away, she went hunting. She considered something of a dying request, so she searched through a lot of fantasy authors. She hadn't heard of me, but she read my Mistborn series. She then called me up and asked me to do it. I didn't know I was being considered. It just came out of the blue. To be asked to finish the series was just astonishing, and I wasn't expecting it. It was a little bit like winning the lottery when you haven't bought a ticket, but someone you love has to pass away before you can win.
That's a lovely quote, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that.
Okay, so he was a fantasy writer.
So, yes, Brandon Sanderson was, and he read Robert Jordan's books and he used that to help train him how to write fantasy books, and now he's incredibly prolific, Brandon Sanderson.
Okay. Yeah, well, again, and this is and this is what I found with writing Chandler. Once I had, if you like, the code down, I could reproduce it over and over, and one creative decision, because I didn't have the freedom of making my own choices in a sense. One creative decision leads to another almost inevitably, and the more creative decisions you make, the quicker it gets. And it's you hurtle along. It's similar to what Georges Perec said about, the Oulipo school and applying constraints to your writing. Once you don't have that total freedom and you have to work within a pattern, it starts flowing. And Perec said of a void, La Disparition, which is the book he wrote without the letter E in it, that it seemed to write itself. So it doesn't shock me that Sanderson suddenly can churn out these books, particularly if he's sort of, in a sense, digested the Robert Jordan code. And I wonder whether his own books read somewhat like Robert Jordan now. I would guess they might.
It's a good question, because I've been recently reading Brandon Sanderson. He's very prosaic. It's very good to listen to on an audiobook. I don't remember Robert Jordan being like that, but it's probably been 10 years now since I read the last one. It was a lot more heavier and dense, I remember Robert Jordan being, but incredible world builder, incredible twisting plot. But I think the writing style would have been a bit older.
Well, it'd be interesting. I mean, we could, in a later podcast, I don't know what the listeners would think of this, but we could do an SZ-style analysis of some Robert Jordan and compare it to Sanderson's 15th. It was the 15th, right? 15th book in this series.
It was meant to be so big that Robert Jordan said they would have to invent a new binding system. But after talking to the publishers, Brandon Sanderson convinced them to split them into 3 volumes. But that was the final one. And apparently Robert Jordan himself wrote the final chapter, so that is still in the final book, because he knew how it's going to end.
Okay. So what would be how long are the chapters? Do you recall?
These are huge, Gareth. Each book is 1,000 pages. I couldn't recall off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, so it would be interesting maybe to look at the last, say, 2 pages of Sanderson's contribution leading into the final 2 pages of that. Into the first 2 pages of that final chapter by Jordan. Because you can pick up all kinds of things quite quickly and see where things, mirror each other neatly and where there are sort of discordant notes. That could be quite interesting, actually. But I'll let you think about it, because that's the sort of thing that would interest me. It might be some sort of podcasting suicide. I don't know. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to look into that further. And I guess so we've sort of got this I definitely don't think it's a problem for someone to finish another person's work. And I don't think it's a problem really if AI is used to do that either. Because again, there's not going to be an authoritative final word on these questions. And even if there is, in 100 years' time, people will look at them and go, well, this is deeply offensive. We're going to have to edit the hell out of all of these books. And so they'll change again, apparently. But yeah, in general, how do you feel about the ethics of, I guess, because we've talked about two sort of ethically thorny topics, the ethics of AI and legacy, I suppose, and the development of a brand beyond the author's life. Are you in general very comfortable with it, or not particularly comfortable with it? What do you think of the major, the major sort of crisis points, if any?
I always struggle with questions of ethics because especially when I'm on the spot, because I always feel like I have to go away and think about it. And now that we've talked a bit more about, obviously, anything. So we love the author Yoko Ogawa. We're going to be reviewing her book Revenge on our next podcast. But when I'm writing, I like to think about her, and I like even Mariana Enriquez. I'm so inspired by her style, and sometimes when I sit down, I try to write very similar to her. And I think it's in any course of a writer's journey, you don't copy, but you emulate those that inspire you until you kind of get all the pieces together and you develop your own style. And when you think about that, what is the issue then with AI doing the exact same thing? In this Atlantic article where they talked about taking 191,000 books that were used without permission to train generative AI systems. But isn't that what we all do? Don't we all can we say that these books were used without permission when they're readily available out in the world?
Yeah, I actually think we can, because the difference is, so if you look at Ogawa or Enrique, they are what they know, and their sensibilities, are profound things. But part of that is what they don't know. What makes great literature is what isn't said as much as what is said. All the silences, all the things that could have been, that weren't. And and again, if you imagine authors all responding to each other, they're responding to a bit of Ogawa and a bit of Enrique. Chuck in some Charles Dickens, and for some reason Poodle Springs will throw those things together and you get something different. Where I think AI becomes problematic is that it knows everything, essentially. And so those sort of silences, those ignorances, which are part of what makes text special, they're not likely to be at play. And I think that perhaps the greatest danger as they attempt to make AI literature is that it will create a deep homogeny in literature, in that we have objectively arrived at what good writing is. And that would not be a good outcome, because that will be the death of writing. So I guess the only thing that would potentially one day, probably not in our lifetimes, be a threat to emerging writers is this idea that there is good writing and we can identify it. It's exactly like the latest AI book. And if you can write like that, you're a good writer. I think that will suck the soul out of what is actually occurring in literature, which is a series of imperfect responses that fly off in all kinds of dizzying directions.
But I feel like we already do that to a certain extent. Any writing course that you want to do online. We'll be like, hey, this is how you write, or you can buy a book from a bookstore that says, hey, this is how you write a bestseller. And it gives you examples of apparently what the best is.
And they're all terrible.
Even publishers then control. Yeah.
I mean, they're terrible for lots of reasons, but they're also wrong because it changes.
But then the issue I'm having in terms of the morality aspect of this is taking these books used without permission to train generative AI.
Well, that's more because it's a property and there's money involved with it. And so the permission would imply some money changing hands. Yeah, but the AI is not, it's not a sentient being, it's a product. It's, it's like I create a database and I fill it with books that I didn't buy. I pulled it off the internet and, and said, this is my repository of fiction, and I can take random lines out, put them together, and so can you. I've got a randomizer, so you can start creating literature. The owners of the intellectual property would come a knocking, saying, well, if you're going to use my stuff, you got to pay me some money. So I think that's the ethical issue, is that essentially they've stolen these works. And it's not that they've read them, it's that they've placed them in a product, which presumably they will then exploit for money. So I think that's the ethical issue with that. But a broader problem, in my opinion, is that you want literature to be surprising. You want it to develop in different ways, and those will be imperfect ways, and they won't be consistent. And if they were consistent, how boring would that be? The next step on the path of consistency is homogeny. And that would be a very sad thing, I think. But again, I'm not convinced by AI as it currently exists. I don't think it's even close to being able to do the things people hope and or fear it will one day be able to do. Which is not to say it won't, but it doesn't seem like it's really all that close. And the limitations of the people building it, in terms of their knowledge, sensibilities, and so forth, kind of allows for that imperfection, which is probably a good thing, really.
Okay, well, I don't then have anything else to add for your question, Gareth.
Well, yeah.
Except the only thing would be, if your fear is that everything will become homogenous, I think humans are very fickle creatures, and as soon as we realize something is the done thing, we purposely go out to create something else and something different, something avant-garde. And I think that continual push and pull will continually happen, even with AI creating the apparent perfect text.
I think you're right, actually. That does seem like the sort of thing that would happen. Assuming, of course, we don't give up our desire to produce things. I do think that there's been a trend over the past century, an accelerating trend of people shifting from producers to consumers. We're described as a consumer society. It'll be a very sad day when that is absolutely true. So hopefully that won't be the case, which is why, again, if you're worried about AI novels, go and write one, produce one yourself. And it may not be perfect. It may not be what Chatbot would have done, but it'll have its own charms, and it'll be part of that big conversation, that ocean of voices that makes up literature and art more generally.
Well, I think that was a good way to wrap up, Gareth. Then thank you for the conversation. I was also fascinated by the different turns that took. Definitely like and subscribe if you enjoyed this kind of different style of chatting and talking, and even come to us with some ideas, and we can also have a little rant on those. And next fortnight, I'm so excited for Revenge. So excited for Revenge by Yoko Ogawa. And I'll see you then when we drop in and have a chat about that, Gareth, and everyone.
I look forward to it.
Bye.
Bye.